For most of the 19th century, the Hittites existed in exactly one place, which was the Bible. No monument, no inscription, and no record in any other language mentioned them at all. They are named more than 40 times. A man called Ephron sells Abraham a field. A soldier called Uriah serves in David's army. Solomon sells them chariots. And outside those pages, nothing. This is what is actually known about them now. It covers where they appear in Scripture, why 19th century scholarship doubted them, the carved stones in a Syrian town that started the argument, the man who was laughed at for insisting, the archive of 10,000 tablets found under a Turkish village, and the careful part, which is what the discovery does and does not settle. Start with the text because it is more specific than people expect. The Hittites are not a vague background people in the Bible. They turn up in particular places, doing particular things, with prices attached. The first time is in Genesis, and it is a property transaction. Sarah has died, and Abraham has no land of his own to bury her in, so he goes to the people among whom he is living. They are called the sons of Heth, and the man who owns the ground is Ephron. The negotiation is conducted in public at the gate of the town, which is where legal business was done. Ephron offers the field as a gift, in the way that a seller does when he has no intention of giving anything away, and Abraham insists on paying. The price agreed is 400 shekels of silver. The text even specifies the kind of silver, current money with the merchant, meaning weighed silver of accepted quality rather than a favor between friends. That is a deed of sale written into a chapter of Genesis. Then they keep appearing. Esau marries Hittite women, and it distresses his parents. Hittites are listed among the peoples of Canaan. Centuries later, a Hittite is one of David's best soldiers. That is Uriah, and the way he is named tells you something. He is Uriah the Hittite in an Israelite army, married to an Israelite woman, and nobody in the story finds this strange. Later still, in the Book of Kings, they are a power rather than a neighbor. Solomon's traders buy chariots out of Egypt at 600 shekels of silver and horses at 150, and sell them on to the kings of the Hittites. Kings, plural, buying chariots. And in a different passage, an Aramean army breaks camp in the night and runs, because it thinks the king of Israel has hired the kings of the Hittites against it. So the Bible describes them as a people you could buy a field from, marry into, and serve alongside, and also as a military power, frightening enough to scatter an army on rumor alone. And for most of recorded scholarship, there was not one line about them anywhere else. Not in the Greek historians, not in the Roman geographers, not in anything that had been dug up and read. That silence is why the objection was raised, and the objection deserves to be stated fairly, because it was not a stupid one. A people that large should have left something behind. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. When a Spade finally turns up a people that only one book had named, does that show the book was right about them, or only that it was using a name that a real people also used? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. Hold that, because the honest answer is more interesting than either of the confident ones, and it takes the rest of the story to get to. The first thread was not found by anybody looking for Hittites. It was found by travelers who kept noticing carvings they could not read, in places where nobody expected carvings at all. Early in the 1800s, a Swiss traveler in Syria noted a block of basalt built into the corner of a house in the town of Hama, covered in small figures cut in relief. Not letters, little pictures. A hand, a foot, a head in profile, arranged in lines that ran alternately left and right, which is a real writing system and not decoration. Nobody could read it, and nobody could match it to any known script, and for the next 60 years it sat in a wall in a Syrian town while the world moved on. In 1872, an Irish missionary named William Wright, working out of Damascus, arranged for those stones to be removed from the walls and taken to a museum in Constantinople. Casts were made and sent to Europe, which matters more than the stones themselves, because it meant scholars in London and Berlin could argue about the same object at the same time. And the same script kept surfacing elsewhere, on a rock face in central Turkey, on seals, on monuments in northern Syria. Always the same little figures, spread across a very large area. A script that turns up over hundreds of miles is not the work of a village. Somebody organized had used it, and had used it long enough for masons in different countries to have learned it. The man who put the pieces together was Archibald Henry Sayce, an Oxford scholar of the ancient languages of the Near East, and he did it in a paper read in 1880. His argument was simple and, for the time, outrageous. The carvings in Syria and the carvings in Anatolia were the same script. The people who cut them had held both regions, and the Bible had a name for them. He proposed that the Hittites of Scripture were not a small tribe in the hills of Canaan, but the remains of a great empire, and that the empire had been centered in what is now Turkey. There was very little to support this beyond the stones, and the reaction was what you would expect. Colleagues called them Sayce's Hittites, which was not a compliment. The joke was that he had invented a nation. It followed him for years, and it is worth remembering that at the time the joke was the reasonable position, and Sayce was the man reaching. He was also right, and he lived long enough to be told so, which is rarer in that profession than it ought to be. 4 years later, William Wright, the missionary who had rescued the Hama stones, published a book putting the same case at greater length and with rather more confidence than the evidence yet allowed. What neither of them had was a single readable sentence. They had a script nobody could pronounce, a distribution map, and a name borrowed from another people's scriptures. What they needed was an archive. The archive was already known about, in the sense that people had walked over it. In 1834, a French traveler named Charles Texier was looking for a Roman town in central Anatolia. What he found instead, near a village then called Bogoskoy, was a ruined city of a size that made no sense to him, with walls running for miles over the hills. There were gateways carved with lions. There was a gate with a sphinx on it. A mile and a half away, there was a natural rock gallery lined with a procession of figures in tall hats. Texier assumed it was Median or Celtic or something else that would fit the maps he had. It did not occur to him that the city belonged to an empire that no map had. The site sat there for another 70 years. Anyone could visit it. Local people had been farming around the walls for centuries and building with the stone, which is what people sensibly do. Then in 1906, a German scholar named Hugo Winkler obtained permission to dig there properly, working with the Ottoman authorities and with an archaeologist named Theodore Macready. Winkler was an Assyriologist, which is the important detail. He could read cuneiform, the wedge writing of Mesopotamia, and cuneiform was a script used by many different languages across the Near East. What he found in the first 2 seasons was a set of rooms, and in the rooms, in fallen heaps where the shelving had burned, clay tablets. Something in the order of 10,000 of them. Most were in Hittite, which nobody could yet read. But a proportion of them were in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, which Winkler could read perfectly well on the spot. That is a very unusual position to be in. He was sitting in the ruins of a city nobody had identified, reading its foreign correspondence in the second week of the dig. The letters were between kings. The city was Hattusa, the kingdom was called Hatti, and its rulers had corresponded as equals with the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon and Assyria. That is the moment the argument ended. Not a mention in somebody else's chronicle, which can always be doubted, but the empire's own filing system, complete with drafts and copies. The archives held treaties, land grants, laws, letters, ritual instructions, inventories, prayers, and a set of instructions for palace officials that reads exactly like an anxious manager's memorandum. Later work took the total, across the site and its outstations, to something like 30,000 tablets and fragments. It is one of the largest archives to survive from the ancient world. And it survived by accident in the way these things usually do. Clay tablets that are stored carefully are fragile. Clay tablets that are in a building when it burns down are fired hard and last forever. The destruction of Hattusa is the reason we can read it, which is a thought worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The language was still a problem. 10,000 tablets are of limited use if most of them are in a tongue that nobody has heard spoken for 3,000 years. The man who solved it was a Czech scholar named Bedřich Hrozný, working during the First War, and the sentence that broke it open is one of the most quoted in the history of decipherment. It was a line about food, written partly in the picture signs that Mesopotamian scribes used for common words, which meant that one word in it could already be read. That word was bread. The sentence ran, in transcription, Nu ninda and ezateni, wata ma ekateni. Ninda was the sign for bread. Ezateni was clearly a verb, and next to bread, the obvious verb is to eat. And Eza looks like the Latin edia, and the German essen, and the English eat. Then comes wata, which any English speaker can read without any help at all. Now you will eat bread, and you will drink water. That is the sentence. And what it proved was not only that the language could be read, but what kind of language it was. Hittite was Indo-European, related to Greek and Latin and Sanskrit, and distantly to English. Nobody had expected that from central Anatolia in the 2nd millennium before Christ, and it rewrote the family tree. Among the tablets was a document that has since traveled a long way from home. It is a treaty made between the king of the Hittites and the pharaoh of Egypt. The two empires had fought at a place called Kadesh, in what is now Syria, in a battle with several thousand chariots in it, and both sides went home and described it as a victory. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel, and there is a new one every day, walking through the life of Jesus. 16 years later, in the 13th century before Christ, they signed a peace. Both copies survive. The Egyptian version is carved on temple walls at Karnak. The Hittite version is one of these tablets. It is the oldest surviving peace treaty between two states anywhere in the world, and it is the only one from the ancient world where both sides' texts can be compared line by line. They match. There are differences of emphasis, each king naturally sounding rather more gracious than the other, but the substance is the same, and the terms are ones a modern lawyer would recognize. A copy of the text hangs at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, which is a curious afterlife for a document written on wet clay in a city whose archive later burned. The terms are worth hearing. Neither king will attack the other. Each will come to the other's aid if a third party does. Fugitives are to be returned, and returned without punishment, which is a clause about mercy inside a treaty about war. The city itself is worth a moment, because the scale of it is the part that photographs badly and matters most. The walls of Hattusa run for something like 6 kilometers over broken ground. That is not a fortress. That is a capital laid out across hills, with an upper city of temples and a lower city of houses, and a rock-cut sanctuary a short walk outside it. The sanctuary is called Yazilikaya, and it is a cleft in the rock lined with carved processions of gods, dozens of them, walking towards each other along the walls. The gates are the thing people remember, lions carved at one entrance, a sphinx at another. A warrior god cut into the stone of a third, life-sized, watching whoever came in. All of this was standing in the landscape the whole time. It was never lost in the way a jungle city is lost. It was simply unexplained, which is a different and stranger condition. Farmers had used the stones, travelers had sketched the lions, and nobody could say whose it had been, because the people who built it had been forgotten so completely that their names survived in one place only. In the Bible, which brings us to the careful part, and this is where a story like this usually goes wrong. The empire in Anatolia called its land Hatti. The people of Canaan whom Abraham dealt with are called the sons of Heth, living around Hebron, several hundred miles to the south. Those are not obviously the same people, and most scholars do not think that they were. The Anatolian Empire did not rule Hebron, and a man selling a burial cave is not the subject of a great king. There is also a third group, and they are the ones the Book of Kings is almost certainly talking about. When the Hittite Empire fell, about 1200 years before Christ, it did not vanish entirely. A set of smaller kingdoms carried on in northern Syria for another 5 centuries, at Carchemish and Hamath and elsewhere, using the same picture writing, ruled by kings with Hittite names. The Assyrians called that whole region the land of Hatti, and those are the kings, plural, who could buy chariots from Solomon's traders and frighten an Aramean army in the night. This is why the older objection did not simply evaporate when Hattusa was read. A scholar could still ask, quite reasonably, which of the 3 the text meant, and whether a writer centuries later had blurred them together. So the Bible is using one word for what were probably 3 related things, across a span of 1,000 years, which is exactly what any ancient text does with a foreign name. Britain does the same thing. We call people French who would not have recognized the word, and we use one name for a country whose borders and language moved several times underneath it. None of that is a problem unless you have asked the text to be something it never claimed to be. It is not a gazetteer. It records who its people dealt with, and it uses the name they used. So back to the question, and to what the discovery actually established. It did not prove that Ephron sold Abraham a field, and no Spade will ever prove that, because private sales leave no monuments. What it did establish is the thing that had been doubted, which was whether a people of that name and that weight had existed at all in that part of the world. They had. They were one of the three great powers of the late Bronze Age, alongside Egypt and Babylon, and they had been forgotten so thoroughly that their capital sat unrecognized for 70 years after it was found. And the Bible's information about them turns out to be the ordinary, unremarkable knowledge of a neighbor, not a theological claim, not a miracle. Just the sort of thing you know about the people up the road. That they were around Hebron, that they sold land and expected to be paid in weighed silver, that some of them served in foreign armies. That further north they had kings and chariots and had to be taken seriously. Every one of those is the kind of detail a text gets right when it is close to the events, and gets wrong when it is invented centuries later by somebody a long way away. It is also worth saying plainly what would have counted as the other outcome. If the archives had turned up no such people, or a people of a different name in a different place, that would have been evidence too, and it would have had to be accepted. That is not proof of anything grander, and it should not be sold as proof of anything grander. It is a small, solid thing, and small, solid things are worth more than large, fragile ones. The joke about Sayces, Hittites, lasted about 30 years. The archive under the village has lasted rather longer, and it will be read for as long as anybody wants to know what those kings said to one another. And a burial cave at Hebron, bought for 400 shekels of weighed silver from a man whose people nobody could find, turns out to have been bought from a people who were simply, quietly, there.